Every Christian knows the Trinity: Father, Son, Holy Spirit, three persons, one God. This is the foundation of Christian theology. But there's a problem. The Trinity as churches teach it is incomplete. Something's missing. Someone's missing. And when you discover who was erased, everything about Christianity changes. In the Gospel of Philip, there's a passage describing the true Trinity, not Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but Father, Mother, Son, the divine masculine, the divine feminine, and the Christ consciousness born from their union. And the Mother, the divine feminine principle, wasn't subordinate to the Father. She was equal, co-creator, co-eternal. If you've always felt something was off about the all-male Trinity, if you've sensed the divine feminine was deliberately excluded, she was there. She was taught. She was worshipped. And then she was systematically erased. Place your hand on your heart, left side. That's where the divine feminine presence anchors in every human body. The divine masculine anchors in the solar plexus. Will, action, power. The divine feminine anchors in the heart. Wisdom, compassion, creation. And when both are active, the Christ consciousness awakens in the crown. This isn't metaphor. This is the actual energetic architecture Jesus taught his inner circle, documented in texts that survived because they were hidden in Egyptian caves for 1700 years. In the next 2 hours, you're going to learn the complete system, not theology, practice. You'll learn the original Trinity structure that includes the divine feminine as equal to God. You'll learn why early Christianity worshipped Sophia, the Divine Mother, and exactly when and how she was removed from doctrine. You'll learn the specific prayer Jesus taught for invoking both Father and Mother. You'll learn the 3-part energetic practice for activating divine masculine and feminine within your own body. You'll learn what happens neurologically and spiritually when you balance both principles. And you'll learn the 30-day integration process that practitioners report fundamentally changes their relationship with the divine. This isn't about belief, this is about direct experience. By the end of this exploration, you'll have tested these practices yourself. You'll know whether the divine feminine responds when you call her. You'll feel whether balancing masculine and feminine principles creates a different quality of consciousness. And you'll understand why restoring the Mother to the Trinity isn't just theological correction. It's the recovery of half of human divine capacity. Let's begin with what the texts actually say. The Gospel of Philip was discovered in 1945 near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, as part of a collection of early Christian writings buried around 390 CE. The Gospel itself dates to the mid-3rd century, but scholars recognize it preserves traditions from the 1st and 2nd centuries, the period when Jesus' immediate students and their students were still alive and teaching. Unlike the canonical Gospels, which were edited and standardized by church councils, Philip survived precisely because it was never canonized. It remained outside official control, hidden by Egyptian monks who refused to destroy texts they considered sacred, even when ordered to do so. The passage describing the Trinity appears in saying 6 of the Gospel of Philip. The Coptic text reads, "There are 3 who always walk with the Lord, Mary his mother, her sister, and Magdalene who is called his companion. For Mary is his sister and his mother and his companion." On first reading, this seems to be about the women in Jesus' life, but Gnostic texts operate on multiple levels simultaneously. The literal level describes actual people. The symbolic level describes spiritual principles. And the initiatory level, meant only for those being trained in the practices, describes the internal energetic reality these figures represent. The 3 Marys represent the 3 aspects of the divine feminine principle. Mary the Mother represents Sophia, the primordial feminine wisdom through which creation occurs. Mary the Sister represents the balanced partnership between masculine and feminine in the spiritual journey. Mary Magdalene represents the divine feminine as intimate companion and equal partner in the work of Christ consciousness. Together they form the complete feminine trinity that walks with and equals the masculine divine principle. But the clearer teaching appears in the Apocryphon of John, another Nag Hammadi text. This one explicitly describes the structure of divine reality before creation. The monad is a monarchy with nothing above it. It is the invisible spirit. It is immeasurable light which is pure, holy, and immaculate. The Father looked into himself, into Barbelo, the clear light which is around him. And Barbelo is the first power, the forethought of all, the image of the invisible spirit. She is the perfect power, the perfect glory, the glory of revelation, the glory of the virginal spirit. And she glorified the invisible spirit because it was through her that the spirit came forth, Barbelo. This is the name almost no Christian has heard. Yet in the earliest Gnostic Christian cosmology, Barbelo is the mother. She is the first emanation from the Father. Not created by the Father, emanated from the Father, meaning she emerges from the Father's own being as his complementary principle. The Father is pure awareness, pure I am consciousness. Barbelo is that awareness becoming aware of itself, creating the capacity for relationship, for love, for creation. Without Barbelo, the Father remains eternally alone, unmanifest, unable to create. With Barbelo, creation becomes possible. The text continues. Barbelo asked the invisible spirit to give her foreknowledge, and when the spirit consented, foreknowledge appeared and stood by forethought. This is the one that came from the thought of the invisible spirit. Then the invisible one gave them a power, and the power that came forth stood by foreknowledge. This is mind. Then Barbelo asked for incorruptibility, and when the spirit consented, incorruptibility appeared. After that, eternal life stood by them, and these five are the Mother, the Father, the Son, the Truth, and the Church. Notice the structure. The Father, invisible spirit, emanates Barbelo, the Mother. Together, Father and Mother generate the divine attributes: foreknowledge, mind, truth, incorruptibility, eternal life. And from the union of all these principles, Christ, the Son, emerges, not as a person born 2,000 years ago in Bethlehem, as the eternal offspring of divine masculine and feminine union, the consciousness that represents the possibility of divinity manifest in form. This is the original Trinity: Father, transcendent awareness; Mother, immanent wisdom and creative power; Son, the consciousness born when transcendence and immanence unite. This Trinity doesn't have three masculine persons. It has masculine principle, feminine principle, and the offspring of their sacred marriage. And every human being, according to these texts, contains this same Trinity structure within their own consciousness. The Gospel of Philip makes this practical application explicit. Light and darkness, life and death, right and left are brothers of one another. They are inseparable. Because of this, neither are the good good, nor the evil evil, nor is life life, nor death death. For this reason, each will dissolve into its original nature. But those who are exalted above the world are indissoluble, eternal. What does this mean practically? The text is describing the nature of duality and how consciousness transcends it. Masculine and feminine, like light and dark, are complementary principles, not opposites in conflict. When you identify with only one principle, when you worship only the Father, invoke only masculine divine attributes, activate only the masculine aspects of your own consciousness, you remain trapped in duality. You have power but not wisdom, authority but not compassion, will but not creativity. You're functioning with half of divine capacity. But when you recognize and activate both masculine and feminine principles, something different happens. The opposites don't cancel each other. They generate a third thing, Christ consciousness, the awareness that transcends duality while including both poles. This is what exalted above the world means, not leaving the world, rising to a level of consciousness where you can hold masculine and feminine, transcendent and immanent, being and becoming simultaneously. Now here's where it gets practical, where we move from theology to technique. The texts describe specific locations in the human body where these principles anchor and activate. The Pistis Sophia, a 3rd century Gnostic text that records Jesus' post-resurrection teachings to his disciples, describes the energetic anatomy in detail. The first mystery is the mystery of the Father. It abides in the ineffable, in the place which is above the head of every man. The second mystery is the mystery of the Mother. She abides in the heart in the place of the left breast, where compassion and wisdom have their throne. The third mystery is the mystery of the Son. He abides in the crown, where the two become one. This is not symbolic language. The Pistis Sophia is describing the energetic centres, what later traditions would call chakras, though the Gnostic system predates Hindu influence in Mediterranean spirituality. The Father principle activates in what we'd now call the solar plexus, the 3rd chakra, the centre of will and personal power. The Mother principle activates in the heart centre, the 4th chakra, the centre of compassion and relational wisdom. And the Christ consciousness, the union of both, activates in the crown, the 7th chakra, where individual awareness opens to universal consciousness. Pay attention to the asymmetry. The Mother abides in the place of the left breast, where compassion and wisdom have their throne, not the centre of the chest, the left side. This is anatomically significant. The heart as a physical organ sits left of centre in the chest. When you place your hand over your heart naturally, you place it on the left side. The vagus nerve, which modern neuroscience has identified as central to emotional regulation, compassion response and the rest and digest parasympathetic nervous system, runs down the left side of the body. The Gnostic texts are describing something that maps onto actual physiology. The solar plexus, the Father principle centre, governs the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, the mobilization of energy for action. It's associated with willpower, decision-making, the capacity to assert boundaries and take action in the world. These are traditionally masculine attributes, though of course both men and women have access to them. When this centre is activated in isolation, you get authoritarianism, aggression, domination, the shadow side of masculine power. The heart centre, the Mother principle, governs the parasympathetic nervous system, the capacity for connection, empathy, nurturing, creative generation. It's associated with wisdom that comes through relationship rather than through assertion. When this centre is activated in isolation, you get passive compassion without boundaries, absorption of others' emotions without discernment, the shadow side of feminine receptivity. But when both centres activate simultaneously and coherently, when the solar plexus generates empowered will and the heart generates wise compassion, and these two streams of energy rise together toward the crown, practitioners report a distinct shift in consciousness, not thinking about divinity, direct awareness of being held within a larger consciousness that is both transcendent and intimate, both powerful and tender, both beyond form and absolutely present. This is what the texts mean by Christ consciousness, not worshipping Jesus as external saviour, activating the same consciousness Jesus embodied, the union of divine masculine and feminine within human form. Now we need to understand why this teaching disappeared. Why, if this was Jesus' actual doctrine taught to his inner circle and recorded in multiple texts, did it vanish from Christianity for 1700 years? The answer is specific, documented, and political. Early Christianity was wildly diverse. From roughly 30 CE to 325 CE, there was no single Christianity. There were Christianities, plural. Some communities followed the version that became orthodox, the version in which Jesus was divine Son of God who died for human sins and was physically resurrected. Other communities followed what scholars now call Gnostic Christianity, which taught that Jesus was a wisdom teacher who revealed the divine nature already present in every human. Some communities had male leadership only. Others had female priests, female bishops, female apostles who taught and initiated new members. The diversity wasn't just organizational, it was theological. Some groups used only the Gospel of Matthew. Others used Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Still others used Thomas, Philip, Mary, the Apocryphon of John, the Pistis Sophia. Some groups baptized once. Others baptized multiple times with different formulae for different initiatory levels. Some celebrated the Eucharist as symbolic remembrance. Others practiced it as a consciousness-altering technique using specific prayers and bodily awareness. This diversity was sustainable as long as Christianity remained a minority movement, scattered communities with no central authority. But in 312 CE, everything changed. Constantine, Emperor of Rome, converted to Christianity after claiming he saw a vision of the cross before a crucial battle. Whether the conversion was genuine spiritual experience or political calculation, the effect was the same. Christianity went from persecuted minority to state-sponsored religion virtually overnight. And state-sponsored religion requires standardization. You can't have an official religion with 40 different gospels, 12 different baptismal formulae, and radically contradictory theological claims. You need one Bible, one doctrine, one church hierarchy. So in 325 CE, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, gathering bishops from across the Roman world to determine what Christianity would officially be. The council decided multiple things. They established the Nicene Creed, which defined Orthodox Christology. Jesus as fully divine and fully human, begotten not made, consubstantial with the Father. They determined the date of Easter. They established church hierarchy, with bishops having authority over priests and male clergy having exclusive authority to perform sacraments. And they began the process of canonization, deciding which texts were authentic scripture and which were heretical. The Gospel of Philip didn't make the cut. Neither did the Apocryphon of John, the Pistis Sophia, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, or dozens of other texts that early Christians had used for 300 years. Why? The official reason was that these texts weren't authentically apostolic, weren't written by Jesus' direct followers, contained theological errors. The political reason was that these texts contradicted the version of Christianity Constantine needed. An empire runs on hierarchy, on clear chains of command, on the concentration of power in centralized authority. The Gnostic texts taught that every person has direct access to the divine, that salvation comes through personal gnosis rather than through church mediation, that feminine wisdom is equal to masculine authority. This is incompatible with imperial Christianity. If anyone can access God directly, you don't need priests. If feminine wisdom equals masculine authority, you can't justify male-only clergy. If Christ consciousness is something you activate within yourself rather than something you receive through institutional sacraments, the Church loses its monopoly on salvation. So the texts that taught these things were declared heretical. Churches were ordered to destroy them. Possessing them became punishable offence, and for the most part the destruction was successful. We might have lost these texts entirely except for one thing. Egyptian monks in the 4th century, when they received orders to destroy their Gnostic libraries, couldn't bring themselves to do it. They hid the texts instead, burying them in sealed jars in the desert near Nag Hammadi, where they remained until 1945 when a farmer accidentally discovered them. The suppression of the texts wasn't just intellectual, it was specifically targeted at the divine feminine. The Nicene Christianity that became orthodox had an exclusively masculine Trinity. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, 3 persons, but the language and imagery were all masculine. God the Father, the patriarchal authority, Jesus the Son, the male saviour, the Holy Spirit, which in earlier Syriac Christianity had been explicitly feminine. The word for spirit in Aramaic, Jesus' actual language, is feminine, was masculinized or neutered into abstract force. Sophia, the Divine Mother, was deleted entirely. References to her were removed from texts that were canonized. The books that centered her, like Wisdom of Solomon, where Sophia is described as co-creator with God, were relegated to the Apocrypha, included in some Bibles, but not considered fully authoritative. Church fathers like Augustine and Jerome wrote extensively about why feminine divinity was dangerous, why women couldn't represent Christ, why the divine must be understood in exclusively masculine terms. The result was systematic. By the 5th century, the divine feminine had been almost completely erased from Christianity. A few traces remained in Marian devotion. The Virgin Mary absorbed some of the attributes of Sophia, became Mother of God, was prayed to as intercessor. But Mary was never divine herself, never equal to the Father, never co-creator. She was the most exalted human, but still human, still subordinate, still requiring a masculine God to grant her any power she possessed. The impact of this erasure goes far beyond theology. When you remove the divine feminine from your religious cosmology, you create a spirituality that operates from only half of human consciousness. You valorize will over wisdom, action over receptivity, transcendence over immanence, the spirit realm over the material world. You create a religion that's uncomfortable with bodies, with sexuality, with the earth itself. Because all these things are associated with the feminine principle that's been deleted. You also create a religion that has no theological basis for the equality of women. If God is only masculine, if divinity is only male, if the only path to salvation is through a male saviour represented by male priests, then women are by definition spiritually inferior. They can be holy, they can be virtuous, but they can't represent the divine. They can't be priests, can't be bishops, can't speak with God's authority. And for 1500 years, that's exactly what happened. Women were barred from clergy, from theological education, from religious authority, based on a trinity that had been deliberately mutilated to remove the feminine half. This brings us to the question of restoration. If the divine feminine was erased from Christianity, if the Trinity was changed from Father, Mother, Son to Father, Son, Spirit, if Sophia and Barbelo were deleted from doctrine and practice, how do we restore them? Not as historical curiosity, as living practice that activates the complete Trinity within human consciousness. The answer comes from the same texts that preserve the teaching. They don't just describe the theology, they describe the practice. And the practice has 3 components: invocation, energetic activation, and integration. Invocation means calling on the divine feminine by name. In Gnostic Christianity, names weren't arbitrary labels. They were sonic formulas that connected consciousness to specific divine principles. When you spoke a divine name with awareness and intention, you were creating resonance between your consciousness and that aspect of divinity. This is why the texts preserve specific names and why those names matter for practice. The primary names for the divine feminine in the Gnostic texts are Sophia and Barbelo. Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom, but it's also the name of a specific divine emanation. Barbelo's etymology is debated. It might derive from Hebrew words meaning God in 4 or daughter of the Lord, but its meaning is less important than its function. Barbelo is the name of the first feminine emanation from the Father, the mother aspect of the Trinity, the principle through which formless awareness becomes creative power. The practice of invocation is straightforward. You speak these names, not casually but with focused intention, calling on the reality they represent. Sophia, Divine Mother, I call on your presence. Barbelo, first thought of the Father, I invoke your wisdom. This isn't prayer in the sense of asking for favours from an external deity. It's more like tuning a radio to a specific frequency. You're using the name to orient your consciousness toward the divine feminine principle, creating the conditions for that principle to activate within your awareness. Practitioners report distinct phenomenological differences between invoking the divine feminine versus the divine masculine. Invoking the Father, calling on I am, on pure being, on transcendent awareness, tends to create a sense of expansion, of consciousness lifting upward and outward, of vast impersonal presence. Invoking the Mother, calling on Sophia, on Barbelo, on divine wisdom, tends to create a sense of descent, of something pouring into you, of intimate presence that knows you personally. Neither is superior, they're complementary, and the practice requires both. The second component is energetic activation. This is where we work with the specific bodily locations the texts describe. Remember, the Father principle anchors in the solar plexus, the Mother principle in the left side of the heart, and the Christ consciousness in the crown. The practice involves bringing conscious awareness to these centers in sequence, and then simultaneously. Here's how it works in detail. You begin with posture, sitting or standing, spine straight but not rigid, in a position you can maintain for 15 to 20 minutes without significant discomfort. Eyes can be open or closed, but most practitioners find closed easier for beginning work. You establish breathing. Smooth, even, not forced or controlled, just natural breathing with awareness. Then you bring attention to the solar plexus, the area about 2 inches above the navel and slightly inward, not thinking about this area, placing the felt sense of your awareness there. You might feel warmth, tingling, pressure, or nothing particular. The sensation doesn't matter. What matters is the location of awareness. You rest attention there for several breaths, then you invoke the Father principle. Father, I am transcendent source. I call on your presence in my solar plexus. You're not imagining the Father is there. You're recognizing that the divine masculine principle is always there, creating will, generating the capacity for intentional action. You're just becoming conscious of it. After establishing awareness in the solar plexus, you shift attention to the heart center, specifically the left side of the chest. Again, you're placing felt awareness there, not thinking about it. Several breaths to stabilize attention. Then you invoke the Mother principle. Sophia, Barbelo, Divine Mother, I call on your presence in my heart. Awaken the wisdom that dwells here. Activate the compassion that is your nature. The practice requires holding both centers simultaneously. This is the crucial step most people skip, and it's why the practice fails for them. You don't activate solar plexus, then drop it and activate heart. You activate solar plexus, then add heart, holding both in simultaneous awareness. Your attention is split between 2 locations in the body, feeling both at once. This is difficult at first. Attention wants to collapse back to single point focus. You have to train it to maintain dual awareness. When you can hold both centers simultaneously for at least a dozen breaths, solar plexus warm with activated will, heart open with activated compassion, you bring attention to the crown, not forcing anything, just lifting awareness to the top of the head while maintaining the connection to solar plexus and heart. The image the texts use is helpful. Imagine 2 streams of energy, one from solar plexus and one from heart, rising like intertwined ribbons toward the crown and meeting there. When that meeting happens, when the masculine principle from the solar plexus and the feminine principle from the heart converge at the crown, practitioners report the activation of a third quality of consciousness. Not masculine, not feminine, the offspring of both, Christ consciousness. It feels like awareness opening beyond personal identity, like the sense of being a separate self becomes porous, and you recognize you're held within a larger awareness that knows you completely. This isn't imagination. Neuroscience research on meditation practices shows that when attention is held simultaneously at multiple bodily locations, particularly when one is in the torso and one is in the head, brain activity shifts. Default mode network, the brain regions associated with self-referential thinking, shows decreased activation. Salience network, regions involved in detecting important stimuli and orienting attention, shows increased coherence. There's measurable change in the brain's functional connectivity when you practice dual-point awareness. The subjective experience correlates with these neural changes. When you're identified solely with mental chatter, with the voice in your head narrating your experience, you're operating primarily from default mode network. When you shift to dual-point bodily awareness, holding attention in solar plexus and heart simultaneously, the default mode quiets. The sense of being a separate self thinking about experience shifts to the sense of being awareness within which experience is happening. And when that awareness expands to the crown, when it opens beyond personal boundaries, that's when practitioners report the felt sense of Christ consciousness. Not thinking about Jesus, but recognizing the same quality of awareness Jesus embodied, the union of human and divine, masculine and feminine, immanent and transcendent. This practice is the energetic activation component, but it requires the third element, integration. You can have profound experiences in meditation, in prayer, in contemplative practice. But if those experiences don't change how you move through daily life, they remain peak moments without transformative power. Integration means bringing the balanced masculine-feminine consciousness into ordinary activity. The texts are clear that this is the purpose of the practice. The Gospel of Philip states, "Those who say that the Lord died first and then rose up are in error, for he rose up first and then died. If one does not first attain the resurrection, he will not die." This is dense language, but it's describing the shift from identification with the mortal ego self to identification with the immortal Christ consciousness. You don't wait until physical death to rise up into divine awareness. You rise up now while alive by activating the complete Trinity within yourself. And once you've done that, once you've recognized yourself as the meeting place of Father and Mother, as the vessel where Christ consciousness is born, the ego self dies because you're no longer identified with it as ultimate reality. Integration practices make this shift stable rather than temporary. The first integration practice is daily invocation. Every morning before the mind gets caught in planning and analyzing, you spend even just 5 minutes calling on both Father and Mother. Father, I invoke your presence. Mother, I invoke your wisdom. May I move through today with both will and compassion, both action and receptivity. There isn't magical thinking, it's intentional alignment, reminding yourself at the start of each day that you have access to both masculine and feminine divine principles. The second integration practice is situational awareness. Throughout the day, you notice when you're operating from only one principle. You're in a conversation and realize you're being all compassion with no boundaries, absorbing the other person's emotions and losing your own center. That's feminine principle without masculine balance. You invoke the Father, bring awareness to solar plexus, access will and discernment to complement the heart's compassion. Or you're in a meeting and realize you're being all assertion with no receptivity, pushing your agenda without listening to others' wisdom. That's masculine principle without feminine balance. You invoke the Mother, bring awareness to the heart, access compassion and relational wisdom to complement the solar plexus's will. This sounds simple, but it's the practice that changes your life. Most people operate habitually from whichever principle they were conditioned to value. Men in patriarchal cultures are trained to suppress feminine principle. Don't show emotion, don't ask for help, maintain dominance and control. Women in the same cultures are trained to suppress masculine principle. Don't be too assertive, don't claim authority, prioritize others' needs over your own. Everyone ends up truncated, operating from half their divine capacity. When you practice situational awareness of which principle you're manifesting, and consciously invoke the balancing principle, you start operating from wholeness. You become capable of powerful compassion and compassionate power. You can take decisive action without trampling others. You can maintain deep empathy without losing yourself. You become what the texts call the androgyne, not gender confusion, but the human being who integrates both masculine and feminine divine principles and births Christ consciousness as their lived reality. The third integration practice is the restoration of the Lord's Prayer. The prayer that made it into the canonical Gospels, the one Christians have recited for 2,000 years, is, "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Notice what's missing: the mother. The divine feminine is entirely absent from this prayer, but the Gnostic version, preserved in fragments across multiple texts and reconstructed by scholars studying early Christian liturgy, includes her, "Our Father and Mother, who dwell in the pleroma beyond all form, hallowed be your names. May your kingdom manifest through us. May your will be expressed through our will, on earth as in heaven. Give us the sustenance that feeds both body and soul. Forgive our separation from you as we forgive those who reinforce separation. Lead us out of archonic illusion and deliver us into the fullness of your being, where Father and Mother are one." The differences are theologically massive. Father and Mother restores the complete Trinity. Dwell in the pleroma uses the Gnostic term for the fullness of divine reality, the realm beyond material creation where all the divine emanations exist in perfect harmony. Your names, plural, acknowledges that the divine has multiple aspects, masculine and feminine, transcendent and immanent, each requiring different names for invocation. May your kingdom manifest through us shifts from passive waiting for God's kingdom to active participation in manifesting divine reality in the material world. Your will be expressed through our will makes explicit that human will is meant to align with and channel divine will, not be crushed by it. Sustenance that feeds both body and soul acknowledges that divine provision isn't just spiritual, but includes material needs. The body matters because creation matters, because the feminine principle honors matter as sacred. Forgive our separation from you names the actual problem, which isn't debt or sin in the moral sense, but the illusion of separation, the failure to recognize our inherent union with the divine. As we forgive those who reinforce separation, shifts the focus from individual wrongdoers to the systemic forces, including religious institutions, that maintain the illusion of separation between humanity and divinity. Lead us out of archonic illusion introduces the Gnostic cosmology of the archons, the imperfect powers who created material reality and who want humans to remain ignorant of their divine nature. This isn't about demons or supernatural evil. The archons represent unconscious forces, systemic structures, internalized beliefs that keep humans trapped in fear, scarcity, and separation consciousness. Leading us out of archonic illusion means awakening from these limiting beliefs, and deliver us into the fullness of your being where Father and Mother are one, names the goal. Not escape from creation, not heaven after death, but realization of the unity of all divine principles within ourselves right now. Practitioners report that praying this restored version of the Lord's Prayer with conscious invocation of both Father and Mother changes their experience of prayer fundamentally. It stops being petitioned to an external authority figure and becomes alignment with the divine masculine and feminine within. It stops being about asking God to fix your problems and becomes about recognizing that you have access to the divine principles that empower you to address your own life creatively. Now let's address the objections, because there are many. The first objection comes from Orthodox Christians who argue that this is heresy, that the Trinity has always been Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that adding the Mother is a distortion of genuine Christian teaching. The response is historical. The Trinity, as Orthodox Christianity knows, it was formalized at the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Before that council, there was no single agreed-upon doctrine of the Trinity. Different Christian communities had radically different theologies. Some were binitarian, worshipping only Father and Son. Some were modalist, believing the Father, Son, and Spirit were different modes of the same being rather than distinct persons. And some, as the Nag Hammadi texts prove, included the divine feminine as essential to the Godhead. The Orthodox Trinity wasn't original apostolic teaching that heretics distorted. It was one theology among many that became dominant through political power, through the backing of the Roman Empire. The texts that taught Father, Mother, Son, Trinity are exactly as old as the texts that teach Father, Son, Spirit, Trinity. Both emerged from the first centuries of Christianity. The difference is that one was canonized by imperial authority and the other was suppressed. The second objection comes from skeptics who argue that these Gnostic texts are unreliable, that they were written too late to represent Jesus' actual teaching, that they're the fantasies of 2nd and 3rd century mystics projecting their own ideas onto Christianity. The response is textual. The Gospel of Thomas, found at Nag Hammadi, has sayings that scholars recognize as potentially earlier than the versions in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The Apocryphon of John contains cosmological material that predates its written form, showing signs of oral tradition from the 1st century. And the practices described in these texts, the energetic activation of bodily centers, the invocation of divine names, the balancing of masculine and feminine principles, match practices from Jewish mysticism, Hellenistic mystery religions, and early Christian asceticism, suggesting they're drawing from genuine 1st century spiritual technology rather than inventing new material. More importantly, the argument about which texts are authentic Jesus' teaching misses the point. We don't have direct access to Jesus' actual words. Everything we have is filtered through decades of oral transmission and the theological agendas of whoever wrote it down. The canonical Gospels are no more authentic than the Gnostic Gospels. They're just the ones that won the political battle for orthodoxy. What matters isn't whether Jesus literally said these specific words, but whether these practices produce the consciousness transformation they claim to produce. That's verifiable through direct experience in a way historical authenticity never can be. The third objection comes from feminists who argue that Gnostic Christianity's divine feminine is still problematic, that Sophia and Barbelo are just projections of feminine stereotypes, wisdom, compassion, receptivity, that keep women locked in traditional gender roles. This is a more sophisticated critique and deserves a more nuanced response. It's true that the Gnostic texts describe the divine feminine in ways that align with traditional feminine attributes. Sophia is wisdom, not will. Barbelo is receptive forethought, not initiating action. The mother creates through response to the father rather than through independent agency. But the texts also describe the divine feminine as co-eternal with the father, as necessary for the father's creative capacity, as equally powerful in her domain. The father without the mother is sterile, unable to create, trapped in eternal isolation. The mother makes creation possible. She's not subordinate, she's complementary. And in human practice, the point isn't to prescribe that women must be feminine and men must be masculine. The point is that all humans, regardless of gender, need access to both principles. A woman practicing this system doesn't have to limit herself to the feminine principle. She activates both father and mother within herself, accessing will and wisdom, action and receptivity as needed for each situation. A man doing the same doesn't have to perform masculinity exclusively. He activates both principles, becoming capable of compassionate strength rather than domineering aggression. The system is liberating precisely because it breaks the gender essentialism that patriarchal religion enforced. There's also a fourth objection worth addressing: the New Age appropriation concern. Critics point out that contemporary goddess spirituality, divine feminine movements, and feminine mysticism often cherry-pick from traditions like Gnostic Christianity without understanding the original context, creating a sentimentalized version of the divine feminine that's more about making women feel validated than about rigorous spiritual practice. This is a fair critique. There's a difference between historical Gnostic Christianity, with its demanding ascetic practices and its insistence on gnosis through direct experience, and modern divine feminine spirituality that emphasizes affirmation and emotional comfort. The Gnostic texts don't present the divine feminine as warm, nurturing mother who makes you feel safe. They present Sophia as the wisdom that emerged from the pleroma, and whose desire to create led to the material world with all its suffering. They present Barbelo as the first power, the forethought of all, a cosmic principle, operating at scales that dwarf human concerns. Invoking the divine feminine in Gnostic practice isn't about comfort. It's about accessing the creative power of the universe, which is beautiful and terrible, generative and destructive, far beyond human preferences. Authentic practice respects this. You don't invoke Sophia to get a hug from the divine mommy. You invoke Sophia to access wisdom that may completely upend your current understanding. You don't activate the mother principle to feel good. You activate it to become capable of creating new reality, which means destroying old reality first. The divine feminine, as these texts present her, is fierce, not soft. Practitioners need to know this, or they'll approach the practice with sentimentalized expectations that the actual experience will shatter. This brings us to the 30-day practice protocol. Based on the techniques described in the Gnostic texts and refined through contemporary practitioners' experience, here's a structured approach for integrating complete Trinity consciousness. This isn't the only way to work with these teachings, but it's a tested progression that builds skill systematically. Days 1 through 7 focus on establishing single-center awareness. Each day, you practice bringing attention to the solar plexus for 10 minutes, and holding it there without distraction. You're not doing anything except placing awareness at that location and maintaining it. When attention wanders to thoughts, you notice and return it to the solar plexus. You're training the capacity for stable attention at a bodily location, which is prerequisite for everything else. Most people discover they can't hold attention in one place for even 30 seconds without the mind pulling away to planning, remembering, or analysing. This week builds the foundational skill. Days 8 through 14 shift to the heart centre. Same practice, different location. 10 minutes daily, attention on the left side of the chest, training the capacity to stay present to felt sensation in the heart area. Many people notice that the quality of awareness feels different at the heart versus the solar plexus. Solar plexus awareness tends to feel more intense, more energized, sometimes aggressive. Heart awareness tends to feel softer, more spacious, sometimes vulnerable. You're not trying to create these qualities, You're just noticing what's already present when you bring attention there. Days 15 through 21 introduce dual awareness. This is where the practice gets difficult. You split attention between solar plexus and heart simultaneously. 5 minutes with attention equally distributed between both centers. This feels impossible at first. Attention ping-pongs back and forth rather than holding both steadily. The trick is to relax the attempt to control attention tightly. You want awareness to be broad enough to include both locations, like peripheral vision includes multiple objects at once. When you notice attention has collapsed to just one center, you gently expand awareness to include the other again. By day 21, most practitioners can hold dual awareness for at least a minute or two without it collapsing. This is when you add invocation. As you hold both centers in awareness, you speak the invocation aloud or internally. Father, I invoke your presence in my solar plexus. Mother, I invoke your presence in my heart. May your powers unite within me. You're using the invocation to strengthen the felt sense of the divine principles in each location. Days 22 through 28 add the crown center. While maintaining dual awareness of solar plexus and heart, you bring a third point of attention to the top of the head. This requires even broader awareness. You're now holding 3 locations simultaneously, or more accurately, you're resting as the awareness that naturally includes all 3. When this stabilizes, even briefly, there's often a distinct phenomenological shift. The sense of effort drops away. The 3 centers feel like they're held within a larger field rather than you having to hold them, and there's often a spontaneous sense of presence, of being met by something greater than yourself. This is where you add the crown invocation. Christ consciousness, born from the union of Father and Mother, awaken in my crown. May I recognize myself as the meeting place of divine, masculine and feminine. May I embody the consciousness that transcends and includes both. The language matters less than the intentionality. You're recognizing that the crown isn't a location you activate through effort. It's what naturally opens when the masculine and feminine principles below rise and meet. Days 29 and 30 are integration days. You bring the practice into activity. You do the meditation in the morning as established, but then throughout the day you practice momentary check-ins. Pause whatever you're doing. Notice which principle you're operating from. If you're being all will with no heart, invoke the mother and feel the heart center activate. If you're being all heart with no will, invoke the Father and feel the solar plexus strengthen. The goal is to catch yourself multiple times per day, making the balanced consciousness automatic rather than something you only access in formal practice. Practitioners report several consistent experiences across this 30-day protocol. First, increased emotional regulation. When you can access both will and compassion consciously, you're less likely to be hijacked by reactive emotional states. Second, better decision-making. Balanced masculine-feminine consciousness means you can consider both the strategic action component and the relational wisdom component before choosing. Third, shift in prayer or meditation quality. Invoking both Father and Mother creates a felt sense of being held by the divine rather than reaching toward a distant God. Fourth, spontaneous insights. The Christ consciousness activation at the crown often correlates with sudden understanding of previously confusing life situations, relationships, or spiritual questions. There are also consistent challenges. The most common is resistance to the divine feminine invocation. People raised in patriarchal religions often have internalized discomfort with praying to a mother god. It feels wrong, blasphemous, even dangerous. Men especially often report feeling weakness or vulnerability when they invoke the mother principle, as if they're surrendering the masculine power that protects them. This is exactly why the practice is necessary. The resistance reveals how deeply patriarchal conditioning has affected even your relationship with the divine. Working through this resistance requires patience. You don't force it. You notice the discomfort, acknowledge it, and gently continue the invocation anyway. Mother, I invoke your presence, even though part of me fears what that means. I trust that you are no threat to my authentic power. Over time, the resistance softens as you realize that the divine feminine doesn't diminish the masculine, she completes it. Another common challenge is discernment between genuine spiritual experience and imagination. When you invoke Sophia and feel a warm presence in your heart, is that the actual divine feminine responding, or is it your brain creating expected sensations based on suggestion? This question has troubled contemplatives for millennia. The Gnostic texts provide a criterion. Genuine gnosis produces transformation. If the practice changes how you move through the world, if it makes you more integrated, more capable, more aligned with reality, then the source of the experience is less important than its fruit. If it's just pleasant feelings that don't affect your actual life, it's probably imagination. A third challenge is balancing personal practice with community. The Gnostic Christians weren't solo practitioners. They gathered in communities, practiced together, supported each other's development. Contemporary practitioners working with these teachings often feel isolated because mainstream Christianity rejects this path, and New Age goddess circles don't have the theological rigor or historical grounding. Finding or creating community that honors both the ancient tradition and the contemporary practice becomes essential for long-term sustainability. Now we need to address the scientific and philosophical framework that explains why these practices work. Modern neuroscience, psychology, and consciousness studies provide language for understanding what the Gnostic texts describe in mythological and theological terms. This doesn't reduce the spiritual to the material. It shows that authentic spiritual practice produces measurable changes in the organism that practices it. The split between solar plexus and heart, between masculine and feminine principles, maps onto the division between sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic system mobilizes energy for action, increases heart rate and blood pressure, sharpens focus, and prepares the body for challenge. This is the biological substrate of the masculine principle: will, action, power. The parasympathetic system promotes rest, restoration, digestion, and connection. It decreases heart rate, increases heart rate variability, activates the vagus nerve, and creates the physiological conditions for bonding and empathy. This is the biological substrate of the feminine principle: wisdom, compassion, receptivity. Most people are chronically stuck in sympathetic dominance because modern life is full of low-level stress. You're always responding to demands, deadlines, threats. The sympathetic system never fully turns off. This manifests as anxiety, insomnia, digestive issues, and emotional reactivity. Learning to activate the parasympathetic system consciously, which is what bringing awareness to the heart center does, creates physiological balance that manifests as emotional stability and mental clarity. But the practice isn't just about parasympathetic activation, it's about the integration of both systems. Research on heart rate variability, the variation in time intervals between heartbeats, shows that high HOI, which indicates flexible shifting between sympathetic and parasympathetic activation, correlates with better emotional regulation, better cognitive performance, and better stress resilience. The Gnostic practice of holding both solar plexus and heart simultaneously is a consciousness-based method for increasing HRV and the flexibility it represents. The crown activation, the Christ consciousness piece, correlates with what neuroscience calls self-transcendent experiences. Research using fMRI and EEG during meditation, prayer, and psychedelic experiences shows that when people report the sense of boundaries dissolving between self and other, when they feel connected to something larger than themselves, there's measurable decrease in activity in the default mode network, particularly in the posterior cingulate cortex and medial prefrontal cortex. These brain regions construct the sense of being a separate self navigating the world. When their activity decreases, the felt sense of being a bounded individual decreases too, and people report experiences of union, oneness, or connection with the divine. The practice of bringing awareness to the crown while holding solar plexus and heart isn't causing this neural change through some mystical mechanism. It's doing it through attentional shifts. When you move attention away from narrative thinking and toward present moment bodily sensation, when you hold awareness at multiple points simultaneously instead of letting it collapse into the single point focus of normal consciousness, you're changing the brain's functional connectivity in ways that naturally decrease default mode activity. The spiritual experience of Christ consciousness and the neuroscience of self-transcendence are describing the same phenomenon from different angles. This is important because it grounds the practice in verifiable reality. You're not taking on faith that invoking Father and Mother will produce transformation. You're doing a practice that has measurable effects on your nervous system and your brain, effects that manifest as changes in how you think, feel, and behave. The theology is a map for the practice. The practice is a technology for changing consciousness, and the changes are real whether you believe the theology or not. Philosophy provides another framework for understanding these teachings. The masculine-feminine polarity appears across philosophical traditions under different names. Plato's forms and matter, Aristotle's act and potency, Chinese philosophy's yang and yin, Hindu philosophy's Shiva and Shakti. These aren't coincidental. They're different cultures recognizing the same fundamental structure of reality. There's a principle of pure being, of formless awareness, of transcendent source, and there's a complementary principle of becoming, of creative manifestation, of immanent presence. Reality requires both. Western philosophy since Descartes has privileged the masculine principle: mind over body, reason over emotion, transcendence over immanence. This creates philosophies that can't account for embodied consciousness, for the role of affect in cognition, for the ways meaning emerges through relationship rather than through abstract reasoning. The Gnostic insistence on the equality of father and mother, masculine and feminine, being and becoming, offers a philosophical corrective. It's a both-and rather than either-or framework. Contemporary feminist philosophy and eco-feminist philosophy have made similar arguments from different angles. When you devalue the feminine principle, when you privilege transcendence over immanence, you create the conceptual conditions for dominating nature, for treating bodies as inferior to minds, for justifying hierarchies of power based on who's more rational or spiritual. Restoring the divine feminine isn't just personal spiritual practice. It's part of the philosophical work of creating worldviews that honor both poles of reality. Psychologically, the integration of masculine and feminine principles appears in Jungian theory as the integration of animus and anima. Jung argued that every psyche contains both masculine and feminine aspects regardless of the person's biological sex. Men need to integrate their anima, the feminine aspect of their psyche, to become whole. Women need to integrate their animus, the masculine aspect, for the same reason. Failure to integrate creates projection. Men project their unintegrated feminine onto women and either idealize or demonize them. Women project their unintegrated masculine onto men and either submit to or rebel against them. The Gnostic practice offers a method for this integration that's more explicit than what Jungian analysis typically provides. You're not just analyzing your projections in therapy. You're actively invoking and embodying both principles. You're training your nervous system to access both sympathetic and parasympathetic activation. You're practicing moving between will and compassion, action and receptivity, consciously and fluidly. Over time, this becomes your default way of being rather than something you have to remember to do. The 30-day protocol is just the beginning. Practitioners who continue beyond the initial month report deeper layers of the practice revealing themselves. The first layer is technical, learning to hold attention at multiple bodily locations and invoke the divine principles. The second layer is emotional, working through the resistances, discomforts and projections that arise when you genuinely engage both masculine and feminine aspects of divinity. The third layer is relational, discovering how balanced masculine-feminine consciousness changes your relationships with others. The fourth layer is existential, confronting the question of who you are if you're not just the ego self but the meeting place where divine principles unite. Each layer requires months or years of practice to fully unfold, but even in the first 30 days, practitioners report tangible shifts. This isn't about believing the right doctrine. It's about doing practices that change your consciousness in ways you can feel and verify through how you move through life. Advanced practitioners also work with the text in more sophisticated ways. The simple invocation practice, calling on Father and Mother by name, is entry-level work. Advanced practitioners study the full Gnostic cosmology, learning the names and attributes of all the divine emanations, understanding how they relate to each other, and invoking specific emanations for specific purposes. For example, when you need deep wisdom for a complex decision, you might invoke Sophia specifically rather than just Mother. When you need the capacity to see truth clearly through deception, you might invoke Aletheia, the feminine emanation representing divine truth. When you need to understand the underlying structure of a situation, you might invoke Barbelo as the forethought who knows all possibilities. This requires study. You read the Apocryphon of John, the Pistis Sophia, the Trimorphic Protenoia, the Gospel of Philip, learning the cosmology these texts teach. You learn that the Pleroma, the fullness of divine reality, contains the Father, Barbelo, and then multiple pairs of male-female emanations called aeons. Each aeon represents a divine attribute. Nous and Aletheia are mind and truth. Logos and Zoe are word and life. Anthropos and Ecclesia are humanity and community. Understanding this structure gives you a sophisticated toolkit for spiritual practice, allowing you to invoke specific divine principles for specific needs. But advanced practice isn't just about complexity, it's also about simplicity. Some practitioners move through the technical phase into what the texts call direct knowing. You stop needing to invoke names or hold attention at bodily locations because the consciousness those practices created has become your baseline. You're just aware of being held within the unity of Father and Mother, masculine and feminine, being and becoming, always. This is gnosis in the fullest sense, not intellectual knowledge about the divine, but direct recognition of yourself as divine manifestation. The texts are clear this is the goal. The Gospel of Philip states, "When the bridal chamber is hidden, it is fornication. But when the bridegroom and the bride are revealed, there is marriage, and their union gives birth to the Son." The bridal chamber is the inner sanctuary where Father and Mother unite. As long as it's hidden, as long as you're unconscious of the divine masculine and feminine within you, the generative power is wasted, produces nothing but ego reinforcement. But when you reveal the bridal chamber through practice, when you recognize the masculine and feminine principles and their union within your own consciousness, that union births the Son, the Christ consciousness, authentic divine humanity. This isn't about gender or sexuality, though the language is deliberately erotic. The texts use bridal chamber imagery because the union of masculine and feminine, the merging of complementary principles, is the closest human analogue to the union of divine principles. And just as sexual union can create new physical life, the union of divine masculine and feminine creates new spiritual life, consciousness that transcends the limitations of either principle alone. Contemporary practitioners sometimes struggle with this imagery if they've experienced religious sexual shame. The association of spirituality with sexuality feels dangerous or blasphemous, but the Gnostic texts don't teach sexual asceticism in the sense of suppression. They teach sacred sexuality, the recognition that the creative power expressed in physical reproduction is the same power expressed in spiritual generation. Some Gnostic groups practiced ritual sexuality as sacrament. Others practiced celibacy as a way to redirect sexual energy towards spiritual generation. Both approaches recognize sexuality as sacred rather than shameful, as an expression of the divine feminine's creative power rather than a fall from purity. For modern practitioners, this means approaching sexuality if you engage it with consciousness rather than compulsion. The divine feminine isn't offended by sexual pleasure. She is sexual pleasure, the joy of creation, the ecstasy of bringing new possibility into form. But unconscious sexuality, sexuality driven by objectification or escape or validation seeking, is fornication in the text's language, generative power used without wisdom, creation without consciousness. The practice of balancing masculine and feminine principles applies to sexuality as much as to any other domain of life. Masculine sexual energy is goal-directed, oriented toward climax, assertive. Feminine sexual energy is receptive, diffuse, oriented toward connection and sensation for its own sake. Most people's sexuality is imbalanced toward one pole or the other. Balancing them creates sexual experience that's both powerful and tender, both assertive and receptive, both oriented towards specific goals and able to rest in present pleasure. This is getting into advanced territory, but it's worth addressing because the texts address it. The Gospel of Philip talks extensively about the bridal chamber, about the hieros gamos or sacred marriage, about the mystery of union. These aren't just metaphors, they're pointing toward practices some Gnostic Christians engaged, practices that used physical union as a vehicle for spiritual realization. Modern practitioners don't need to engage these practices. Many work with the teachings in entirely non-sexual ways, but understanding that the tradition includes sacred sexuality prevents reducing the divine feminine to disembodied abstraction. Now let's address the question of who these teachings are for. The Gnostic texts themselves suggest not everyone is ready for them. The Gospel of Thomas begins with, "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Didymos Judas Thomas wrote down. And he said, 'Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death.'" The implication is that the interpretation isn't obvious, isn't accessible to everyone, requires a certain level of development or preparation. This creates tension with contemporary democratic values. We want to believe that all spiritual teachings should be available to everyone, that there's no elite or hierarchy of spiritual attainment. But the text suggests some people are pneumatics, spirit people, ready for direct gnosis. Some are psychics, soul people, who need the mediation of myth and religion. And some are hilics, matter people, who are entirely identified with physical existence and have no interest in spiritual development. This is uncomfortable language because it sounds like spiritual elitism, but maybe it's just descriptive rather than prescriptive. Some people are genuinely ready to deconstruct their religious conditioning, to question everything they've been taught about God, to engage demanding practices that might destabilize their sense of self. These are the pneumatics. Other people need the security of clear doctrine, established rituals, community agreement about what's true. These are the psychics. Still others are primarily focused on physical survival, material success, sensory pleasure, with little interest in anything else. These are the hilics. None of these categories is superior or inferior. They're different developmental stages or different orientations of consciousness. And people can move between them. Someone who's hilic at 20 might become psychic at 40 and pneumatic at 60. Someone who's pneumatic about spirituality might be hilic about politics or relationships. The categories describe where your consciousness is oriented in a given domain, not your essential nature. If you're reading this, if you've made it this far into an exploration of Gnostic Christianity's divine feminine teachings, you're probably pneumatic, at least in this domain. You're ready to question, to practice, to test these teachings against direct experience. That doesn't make you special, it makes you responsible. Because what you learn has to be embodied, integrated, lived. Otherwise it's just spiritual materialism, collecting exotic teachings to bolster your identity as a seeker without actually transforming. The test is simple. Does your practice make you more loving, more capable of wise action, more able to hold both strength and tenderness, more conscious of the divine principles moving through every moment of your life? If yes, continue. If no, you're either practicing incorrectly or the teaching isn't for you. This brings us to the question of lineage and transmission. The Gnostic Christians believed in apostolic succession, the idea that spiritual realization is transmitted from teacher to student in an unbroken line. Jesus taught his disciples taught their students, and so on, generation after generation, with the teaching preserved through direct transmission rather than just through texts. When the Gnostic churches were destroyed, when their teachers were killed or forced underground, that transmission lineage was broken. We don't have living teachers who can trace their training back to the original Gnostic communities. We have texts, we have archaeological evidence, we have scholarly reconstruction. But we don't have the living transmission, the embodied teaching passed from consciousness to consciousness. This is a genuine loss. Texts can describe practices, but they can't correct your mistakes, can't respond to your specific obstacles, can't adjust the teaching to your particular needs the way a living teacher can. Some contemporary teachers claim to have recovered Gnostic lineage through vision, channeling, or past life memory. Approach such claims with healthy skepticism. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Someone who claims they've channeled the authentic teaching from Sophia herself might be having genuine spiritual experiences, or might be unconsciously inventing what they expect to hear. Without verification, without multiple practitioners independently arriving at the same insights and practices, there's no way to know. The more honest approach is to acknowledge that we're reconstructing these teachings from fragmentary evidence, testing them in practice, and verifying them through results. When multiple practitioners working independently with the same texts report similar experiences, activation of distinct energies at solar plexus and heart, consciousness shift when both are held simultaneously, spontaneous insights when crown center opens, that's evidence the teaching is pointing to something real. When practitioners report their lives becoming more integrated, their relationships improving, their capacity for both power and compassion increasing, that's evidence the practices work. This is how new lineages begin. A teaching emerges or is recovered. Practitioners test it. Those for whom it works continue practicing and begin teaching others. Over time, if the teaching is authentic, a community forms. Standards develop for practice, for teaching, for verification. A living lineage comes into being. This is happening now with Gnostic Christianity's divine feminine teachings. Small communities of practitioners are forming, sharing experiences, refining techniques, beginning to teach. If you're called to this work, find or create community. Practice alone for the first 30 days if you need to establish your own relationship with the teaching. But after that, connect with others, share what you're discovering, learn from their experiences. This teaching isn't meant to be a solitary path. The divine feminine is fundamentally relational. She's known through connection, through the shared field that emerges when multiple consciousnesses hold the same intention. The long-term trajectory of practice is worth discussing. What happens after months or years of invoking both Father and Mother, of holding balanced masculine-feminine consciousness, of birthing Christ awareness in your crown? The texts suggest multiple possibilities. Some practitioners become teachers themselves, transmitting the practice to others. Some become contemplatives, going deeper into direct knowing until personal identity becomes transparent to divine identity. Some become what the texts call pneumatic Christians, living ordinary lives but with consciousness rooted in gnosis rather than in ego. All three paths are valid. Teaching is service, offering others access to practices that transformed you. Contemplation is deepening, exploring the infinite depths of divine consciousness. An integrated spiritual life, working, raising families, engaging the world, but from Christ consciousness rather than from ego, is perhaps the most challenging and most necessary. Because the world needs people who can act with both power and wisdom, who can bring divine consciousness into material reality, who can transform systems and structures from the inside. This is where the practice becomes political in the deeper sense, not partisan politics. The politics of power and relationship, of how humans organize collective life. When you restore the divine feminine to your consciousness, when you balance masculine will with feminine wisdom, you stop being able to participate unconsciously in systems built on masculine dominance. You can't unquestioningly accept hierarchies that concentrate power at the top without wisdom from below. You can't ignore the voices of the marginalized, the people carrying the feminine principle in cultures that devalue it. You can't keep treating the earth as a resource to extract rather than as sacred body of the Divine Mother. The Gnostic texts are clear that archons, the imperfect rulers of material reality, maintain control through ignorance. When humans don't know their divine nature, don't know they have direct access to source, don't know they contain both masculine and feminine divine principles, they remain dependent on external authority. They look to priests for salvation, to governments for permission, to experts for knowledge, never trusting their own capacity to know truth directly. The archons want this dependence because it maintains their power. Gnosis breaks the dependence. When you activate Christ consciousness, when you recognize yourself as the meeting place of Father and Mother, you stop needing external mediators. You can listen to teachers, read texts, participate in communities, but you're not dependent on them for your connection to the divine. You have that connection directly. This is why the institutional church suppressed these teachings, not because they were false, because they were too true, because they threatened the church's monopoly on salvation. Contemporary practitioners face the same choice early Gnostics faced. Do you work within institutional religion, trying to reform it from inside, or do you work outside it, creating new communities based on direct experience? Both approaches have value and risk. Working inside, you have access to resources, to people who might not seek out alternative spirituality, but who are ready for deeper teaching. But you're constrained by institutional requirements, by doctrines you may not believe, by hierarchies you can't fully challenge. Working outside, you have freedom to teach and practice without constraint, but you lack institutional support. You're starting from scratch in building community, and you risk creating isolated bubbles that have no influence on the broader culture. The Gnostic solution was to do both. Some Gnostic Christians participated openly in institutional churches while maintaining secret teachings for initiates. Others formed separate communities. The point wasn't purity, but effectiveness. How do you transmit the teaching to those who need it? Whatever approach serves that goal is appropriate. For contemporary practitioners, this might mean staying in your church while quietly introducing people to contemplative practices that activate direct experience. It might mean starting a study group that reads Gnostic texts alongside canonical scripture. It might mean leaving institutional religion entirely and creating new community. The question to ask is, where can you be most effective in transmitting this teaching and embodying this consciousness? There's also the question of interfaith practice. The divine masculine and feminine aren't uniquely Christian concepts. They appear in Kabbalah as Tiferet and Shekinah, in Hinduism as Shiva and Shakti, in Taoism as Yang and Yin, in indigenous spiritualities across the world. Someone drawn to Gnostic Christianity's version of these teachings might also be drawn to Jewish mysticism or Hindu Tantra or Taoist alchemy. Can you practice multiple traditions simultaneously? The answer depends on what you mean by practice. If you're collecting techniques from different traditions without understanding their contexts, without committing to any particular path long enough to be transformed by it, that's spiritual consumerism. But if you practice one tradition deeply enough that you understand its essence, and then recognize the same essence expressed differently in another tradition, that's spiritual maturity. The Gnostic texts themselves drew from Judaism, Greek philosophy, Egyptian mystery religions, and early Christianity, synthesizing elements from all into coherent teaching. They weren't purists, they were synthesizers. The criterion is coherence and effectiveness. Does adding practice from another tradition clarify or confuse your understanding? Does it deepen your realization or scatter your attention across incompatible frameworks? Trust your experience. If studying Kabbalah illuminates something about Gnostic Christianity you hadn't understood, if Hindu understanding of Shakti gives you clearer language for the divine feminine than Sophia alone provides, integrate it. But if you're just accumulating exotic terminology without practical deepening, simplify. Now let's discuss common obstacles that arise in practice and how to work with them. The first obstacle is doubt. You invoke the Divine Mother and feel nothing. You hold attention at solar plexus and heart simultaneously and experience no consciousness shift. You practice for weeks with no apparent result. The doubt becomes overwhelming. This is just imagination. There's nothing real here. I'm wasting my time. This is normal. Spiritual practice isn't magic. You don't say the right words and immediately transform. You're retraining nervous system patterns, reshaping neural pathways, shifting the default modes of consciousness that have been conditioned by decades of socialization. That takes time. The texts are clear about this. The Gospel of Philip says, "Those who sow in winter reap in summer. Winter is the world. Summer is the other aeon." You practice when there's no apparent result, and the result appears later, sometimes much later. The way through doubt is commitment to the practice regardless of results. You decide you're going to invoke Father and Mother daily for 6 months, whether you feel anything or not. You're going to hold attention at solar plexus and heart for 20 minutes every morning, whether consciousness shifts or not. You're trusting the process rather than demanding immediate validation. This isn't blind faith, it's experimental rigor. You're giving the hypothesis a genuine test over sufficient time before drawing conclusions. The second obstacle is resistance, often unconscious. You intend to practice but keep forgetting. You set aside time for meditation and suddenly remember urgent tasks that must be done immediately. You start the invocation and feel overwhelming sleepiness. This is the psyche's defense against transformation. Some part of you recognizes that if you genuinely activate divine masculine and feminine, if you birth Christ consciousness, your current identity will have to die. The ego self that's been running your life will become transparent to something larger. This is terrifying at the unconscious level. The way through resistance is to acknowledge it without fighting it. I notice I'm resisting this practice. Part of me is afraid of what will happen if I truly change. I acknowledge that fear, and I'm choosing to practice anyway, gently, without forcing. When sleepiness arises during practice, you recognize it as resistance rather than as legitimate tiredness. When you forget to practice, you notice the pattern, understand what's happening, and recommit. Resistance doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're getting close to something real. The third obstacle is spiritual bypassing. The practice starts working. You begin having genuine experiences of expanded consciousness, of feeling held by divine masculine and feminine, of moments of Christ consciousness at the crown. And you use these experiences to avoid dealing with psychological wounds, relationship problems, material responsibilities. You tell yourself you're beyond all that. You're operating from Christ consciousness now. Mundane concerns don't matter. This is the pneumatic's characteristic trap. You access transcendent consciousness and use it to escape from imminent responsibility. But authentic Gnostic teaching doesn't work this way. The whole point of the divine feminine principle is immanence, honouring matter and body and relationship as sacred. If your spiritual practice makes you less capable of handling practical life, less willing to address psychological shadows, less engaged with the people and world around you, you're using it as escape rather than as awakening. The way through spiritual bypassing is integration. You practice activating transcendent consciousness and bringing it into ordinary activity. You use the wisdom accessed in meditation to address relationship conflicts more skillfully. You use the balanced masculine-feminine awareness to make better practical decisions about work and money and health. You recognize that Christ consciousness isn't about being above the world. It's about being fully present within the world while aware of the divine principles animating everything. The fourth obstacle is isolation. You're practicing alone, transforming in ways the people around you don't understand, feeling increasingly disconnected from your previous communities and relationships. Your church friends think you've abandoned true Christianity. Your secular friends think you've gone woo-woo. Your family doesn't know what to make of you. You feel profoundly alone. This is why community matters. You need to find even one or two other people who understand this path, who are doing similar practice, who can witness and mirror your transformation. Online communities can serve this function. If you can't find local practitioners, the key is finding people who take the practice seriously, who are willing to do the actual work rather than just discuss the concepts, who can offer both support and challenge. That said, some degree of isolation is inevitable on any genuine spiritual path. You're differentiating from collective conditioning. You're questioning beliefs most people take for granted. You're having experiences that can't be fully communicated to those who haven't had them. This is part of the territory the texts acknowledge it. Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas says, "I have cast fire upon the world, and see, I am guarding it until it blazes." The fire is gnosis, direct knowing. It's disruptive. It separates you from unconscious participation in normal life, but it also blazes, creates light, transforms. You don't seek isolation for its own sake, but you don't avoid the path because it requires you to stand somewhat apart from mainstream consciousness. You find the balance, engaged with the world but not defined by it, in relationship with people but not dependent on their validation, willing to be alone when necessary while also creating authentic connection where possible. The fifth obstacle is inflation. The practices work. Consciousness expands. You have genuine realizations, and you conclude you're spiritually advanced, maybe even enlightened. You start seeing yourself as teacher when you're still a beginning student. You start judging people who don't have your insights. You become arrogant, condescending, certain of your superiority. This is ego co-opting spiritual development for its own purposes. And it's insidious because there's a grain of truth in it. You have developed. You do have insights others lack. You're capable of things you weren't before. But authentic development includes humility, the recognition that the more you understand, the more you realize how much you don't understand. Inflation is the sign that ego is still running the show, just with new spiritual content. The way through inflation is to keep practicing. The texts are clear that Gnosis includes knowing your own limitations. When you genuinely recognize yourself as the meeting place of divine masculine and feminine, you also recognize how tiny that meeting place is compared to the fullness of the pleroma. You're not God. You're a localized manifestation of divine principles, one spark in an infinite fire. This is simultaneously your glory, you are divine, and your humility. You're one small expression of the divine, not the whole. Practically, this means continuing to study, continuing to work with teachers or peers who can check your understanding, continuing to test your realizations against lived experience. If your spiritual insights make you kinder, more patient, more able to admit error and learn from it, they're authentic. If they make you more rigid, more certain, more dismissive of others, they're ego distortions. Now let's return to the question of verification. How do you know if any of this is real? How do you distinguish genuine spiritual experience from imagination, authentic gnosis from self-deception? The Gnostic texts provide several criteria. First, coherence with the teaching. If your experience contradicts everything the texts say, you're probably misunderstanding something. But if your experience confirms what the texts describe, distinct energies at solar plexus and heart, shifting consciousness when both activate simultaneously, sense of being held by masculine and feminine divine principles, that's evidence you're on the right track. Second, transformative effect. Gnosis isn't just knowing things, it's being changed by what you know. If your practice produces no change in how you live, how you relate, how you understand yourself and reality, it's not Gnosis. But if you find yourself more capable of balanced action, more able to access both power and compassion, more at peace with yourself and the world, that transformation is verification. Third, fruit in the world. Jesus said, "You will know them by their fruits." This applies to teachings and practices as much as to people. If engaging this teaching makes you more loving, more wise, more effective in serving the good, that's good fruit. If it makes you isolated, fearful, judgmental, that's bad fruit. Trust the fruit more than the experience itself. Fourth, consistency across practitioners. When multiple people practicing independently report similar experiences, that's evidence the practice is activating something real rather than just individual imagination. The fact that practitioners across different backgrounds and cultures report feeling distinct energies at solar plexus and heart, report consciousness shifts at the crown, report increased capacity for balanced masculine-feminine awareness, suggests the teaching is pointing to actual structures of consciousness rather than to culturally conditioned fantasies. Fifth, integration with other knowledge. Authentic spiritual teaching doesn't contradict well-established science or philosophy. It might go beyond current scientific understanding, might address questions science doesn't ask, but it shouldn't require you to deny what we reliably know. The Gnostic teaching about masculine-feminine balance, about energetic centers in the body, about the transformation of consciousness through practice, all of this integrates well with neuroscience, with psychology, with philosophy. That's not proof it's true, but it's evidence it's not nonsense. Using these criteria, practitioners can verify the teaching through direct experience. You don't have to take anyone's word for it. You do the practices, you observe the effects, you test the results against the criteria. Over time, you develop confidence based on your own experience rather than on external authority. This is what Gnosis means, not believing the right doctrines, knowing directly. The Gospel of Philip says, "Truth did not come into the world naked, but it came in types and images. The world will not receive truth in any other way." The types and images, the mythological language, the theological concepts, the ritual practices are vehicles for truth, not truth itself. Truth is the direct knowing that arises when you practice. Everything else is pointing toward that knowing. As we approach the end of this exploration, let's address the question of where to go from here. You've learnt the historical context, the theological framework, the basic practices, the common obstacles. You understand why the divine feminine was erased from Christianity and why restoring her matters. You know how to invoke both father and mother, how to activate masculine and feminine principles at solar plexus and heart, how to recognize Christ consciousness when it emerges at the crown. You have the 30-day protocol for beginning practice. What's next? The obvious answer is to practice. Stop reading, stop learning about the teaching, and start doing the teaching. Dedicate 30 days to the protocol. See what happens. Verify through your own experience whether this is real. But there are also resources for going deeper. If you want to study the texts themselves rather than relying on others' interpretations, start with the Gospel of Thomas. It's short, direct, and less cosmologically complex than other Gnostic texts. Move on to the Gospel of Philip, which provides the clearest teaching about the divine feminine and the bridal chamber. Then tackle the Apocryphon of John for the full cosmology. Read the Pistis Sophia if you want detailed descriptions of energetic practices. All these texts are available in English translation, most in multiple versions with scholarly commentary. For secondary sources, Elaine Pagel's work on Gnostic Christianity is accessible and historically rigorous. Her books, The Gnostic Gospels and Beyond Belief, provide excellent context for understanding how and why Orthodox Christianity suppressed Gnostic teachings. For specifically divine feminine focus, Caitlin Matthews' Sophia, Goddess of Wisdom, Bride of God, traces the divine feminine through Jewish and Christian mysticism. For practice orientation, Tal Malachi's Saint, Mary Magdalene, the Gnostic tradition of the Holy Bride, offers a contemporary Gnostic Christian approach that includes specific contemplative techniques. You can also seek out contemporary teachers. There are small but growing communities of Gnostic Christian practitioners. The Ecclesia Gnostica and the Apostolic Johannite Church are organized churches teaching from Gnostic texts. Various independent teachers offer workshops, retreats, and online courses in Gnostic Christianity and divine feminine spirituality. Approach all teachers with discernment. Are they asking you to believe them or to verify teachings through practice? Are they building communities or collecting followers? Are they embodying the balanced masculine-feminine consciousness they teach? Trust those who point you back to your own experience rather than toward dependence on them. You might also explore parallel traditions. If the Gnostic Christian language doesn't resonate for you but the practices do, investigate Jewish Kabbalah's approach to divine masculine and feminine. Study Hindu Tantra's understanding of Shiva and Shakti. Read about Taoist internal alchemy's cultivation of yin and yang. These traditions developed independently but recognize similar principles. Learning their approaches might clarify aspects of Gnostic practice that remain obscure. But again, the essential thing is practice. All the study, all the reading, all the concepts mean nothing without the direct experience that comes from doing the work. The Gnostic texts were never meant to be read as information. They were written as manuals for transformation. They're describing practices that the earliest Christians did, practices that change their consciousness, practices that can change yours if you engage them seriously. The world needs this work. We're living in a culture built almost entirely on masculine principle, without feminine balance, will without wisdom, action without compassion, power without relationship. The results are everywhere. Environmental destruction, because we treat the earth as a resource rather than a sacred body. Social fracture, because we privilege competition over connection. Political polarization, because we assert positions without listening to others' truth. Individual suffering because we're taught to achieve and dominate, but not to rest and receive. Restoring the divine feminine isn't just personal spiritual development, it's civilizational necessity. We need people who can access both masculine will and feminine wisdom. We need leaders who can take decisive action and hold space for collective process. We need systems that value both efficiency and sustainability, both individual achievement and community well-being, both rational analysis and intuitive knowing. This is what the practice of balanced masculine-feminine consciousness creates. Not perfect humans. Humans who are more whole, more integrated, more capable of holding the complexity and paradox of real life. Humans who can invoke both father and mother, who can embody both power and tenderness, who can birth Christ consciousness and bring it into the world. The Gospel of Philip ends with this teaching. If anyone becomes a son of the bridal chamber, he will receive the light. If anyone does not receive it while he's here, he will not receive it in the other place. The bridal chamber is the union of divine masculine and feminine within your consciousness. Becoming a son of the bridal chamber means recognizing yourself as the offspring of that union, as Christ consciousness embodied. And receiving the light means actualizing that recognition in lived reality, not just knowing it conceptually, but being it practically. This is the work, not waiting for salvation from external savior, not depending on priests or institutions to mediate the divine, but recognizing the divine is already present within you as the union of father and mother, masculine and feminine, transcendent and immanent, and living from that recognition, allowing it to transform every aspect of your life. The divine feminine was erased from Christianity, but she was never gone. She's been here all along, in your heart, waiting for you to remember her, to invoke her, to restore her to her rightful place alongside the Father. When you do that, when you practice the union of both principles, you're not creating something new, you're recovering what was always true, you're becoming what you've always been, you're activating the complete Trinity, the whole human, the consciousness that Christ himself embodied and taught. This is your inheritance. This is your possibility. This is the gnosis that was hidden for 1700 years and is now available to you. The only question is whether you'll practice, whether you'll test these teachings against direct experience, whether you'll do the work of integration that makes Christ consciousness not something you think about, but something you are. The texts have been preserved, the practices have been recovered, the teaching is here. What happens next depends on you.